Hello. Thank you for coming, everybody. Our guest speaker tonight is David Joyner, whose novel Kanazawa was released in January 2022 by Stonebridge Press. It's the first published literary novel set in Kanazawa in Ishikawa Prefecture. And it's a captivating, atmospheric tale of life, love, and art in one of Japan's great historic and cultural hubs. Alex Kerr, the author of Lost Japan and Dogs and Demons, called it a graceful novel of a graceful city. Roger Pulvers, the author of Live, wrote the following: the grand old city of Kanazawa, its lush historic environs and rich cultural legacy form the setting of this compelling narrative. Kanazawa weaves an intriguing story of a Japanese family worthy of the best of Japanese literature. And finally, Ian Maloney, author of The Only Gaijin in the Village, said the following: in Kanazawa, David Joyner has written a book not unlike its titular city, with the great historical depths hidden beneath a deceptively tranquil surface. A story of misunderstandings, miscommunications, and family secrets centered around a marriage that seems doomed to fall apart under the weight of unspoken resentments. Above all, Kanazawa drips with a sense of place, the setting much more than just a backdrop to the action. Joyner shows that there are plenty of stories taking place outside the vortex of Tokyo. Tense, moving, and subtly gripping, Kanazawa is a welcome addition to the books about Japan shelf. In tonight's book break, David will discuss Kanazawa and read some part of it for you. A special focus will be given to the local cultural elements he incorporated into his novel, and in particular the works and biography of Kanazawa-born writer Izumi Kyoka. David Joyner first came to Japan in 1991 and has made it his home periodically since then. He spent more than a decade in Vietnam. In addition to Kanazawa, he's authored the novels Lotus Land and The Heron Catchers, forthcoming from Stonebridge Press, and is at work on a third Ishikawa novel and a book of haiku. So without any more delay, let me turn the microphone over to David Joyner. David.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you also to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan for inviting me to speak here tonight. It's a place I've long known about, but have never had the pleasure of visiting. I'd also like to thank Moriwaki Hiroko-san for replying to so many of my emails over the last few months in an effort to set up this presentation. I'm very grateful and honored to be here today, and I hope I'll keep your interest for the time I've been allotted to speak. Earlier today, I learned something new and perhaps important. My friend who's here tonight, Daya Hashimoto-san, told me that if you write the character for person on your palm 3 times and you pretend to swallow those 3 characters, then it will reduce your agitation or your nervousness before speaking in front of a crowd, so large or small. So if you see me doing that 20 or 30 times during this presentation, you'll know what's going on. Okay. I think that's called hito nomu? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. Thank you for that. Yeah. So I'm going to discuss my latest novel, Kanazawa, and read a short section from it. I'll also discuss the influence of Izumi Kyoka's life and work on this novel, though I want to emphasize that I'm by no means a Kyoka expert. I've read his works available in English and have combed through critical biographies about his life, and in the city of Kanazawa and elsewhere, I've bumped into his past and sought out who he was both as a person and as a writer. By those efforts, I simply became a fan of his. Okay, So here's what Kanazawa is about in my own words, for those of you who haven't read it yet, or as a reminder for those of you who kindly have. Kanazawa is about a cross-cultural marriage between a 36-year-old American man named Emmett and his Japanese wife, Mirai. Emmett, despite having just quit his job as a university teacher, is eager for them to put their roots deeper into Kanazawa, where they live, and thinks that getting a machiya, or a traditional Japanese townhouse that he deeply admires and associates with Japan's cultural past, will benefit their marriage and life together. Mirai, however, unexpectedly pushes for them to move instead to Tokyo, where her younger sister Asuka has found a job, and where Mirai also has been offered work as an ikebana artist. That opposition between small and big city life, between traditional and contemporary life in Japan, is at the heart of their conflict. At the same time, Emmett's parents-in-law are facing a family secret, and that secret involves Mirai, without her being aware of it. It's also behind Mirai's father's obsession with the many female statues in Kanazawa and Mirai's mother's disapproval of the drawings he makes of them. And it's when the secret is finally dealt with, or is at least revealed to Emmett, that he sees his marriage in a different light and he and Mirai can finally move forward together. I wrote Kanazawa between late 2016 and mid-2019, a little less than 2.5 years from start to submission. It was accepted for publication in the spring of 2020 by Stonebridge Press, a publisher in Berkeley, California, that's been publishing books about Japan for over 30 years, among them Tokyo Junkie by Robert Whiting. Kanazawa was published as he said, was published in January of this year. Now that I've introduced the novel, I'd like to explain why I wrote it. I wanted to write the first literary novel in English set in the city where my wife and I were then living. I should add that we moved to the USA in late 2019, but returned to Japan this summer and are living once more in Kanazawa. Kanazawa is such a rich place culturally. I thought I could do a lot, at least potentially, by incorporating certain cultural elements into my novel. Also, I wanted to see if I could contribute in some small way to the literature that's associated with Kanazawa. Another reason for writing it was that I hoped my novel might bring more attention to the city, and also to Izumi Kyoka's fiction that's been translated into English, but isn't as widely known as I personally think it should be. I'd love to see more of his work made available in English, especially his novels. And I'd like to see the 2 collections of his short stories, already available in English, gain wider readership. I don't think my novel, even if wildly successful, would necessarily make these things happen. But if read by the right people or by enough people, anything could happen. Let me tell you briefly who Izumi Kyoka was. If all of you sitting before me are like most people I've met, it's likely that you have never read his fiction or read or seen his plays, or know much, if anything, about his life, a situation I'd like to rectify. Of course, it's possible that some of you know much more about him than I do, in which case I apologize for the unenlightening info I'm now going to impart. Izumi Kyoka was born in Kanazawa in 1873, died in Tokyo in 1939, and is widely respected in Japan as an author. Although he's generally considered to be Kanazawa's most famous writer, he's little known outside of Japan. His work is recognized as difficult to translate, probably because it is sometimes hard to penetrate. And while his work nearly always develops from a specific archetype, his mastery of the Japanese language is considered by many to be second to none. Such accomplished and influential authors as Yasunari Kawabata, Junichiro Tanizaki, Yukio Mishima, and Ryunosuke Akutagawa greatly admired his writing and also his vision as an author, which for most of his writing life conflicted with the literary establishment's approach to modern Japanese fiction. Kyoka's loyalty as an author was to traditional, that is Edo period, Japanese literature and a highly lyrical style of expression, to his own unique brand of romanticism and aestheticism, and not to the naturalism that dominated literature during his time. With that brief explanation behind us, let me move on. We'll return a bit later to the question of who Kyoka was. I'd like now to touch on my approach to writing about Japan as a non-Japanese, something that comes up from time to time. I've been deeply interested in Japan and Japanese literature for over 30 years. I was a Japanese studies major at Earlham College and made my first trip to Japan in 1991 on a study abroad program that had me in the country, in Sapporo mostly, for 5 months. I've read and reread a lot of Japanese fiction over that period, which cumulatively, I'm sure, has influenced my writing significantly and my whole approach to storytelling in many ways. If my novel reads like it was written by a Japanese person and translated into English, translated well, I hope, it would be a sort of validation for me because that's something I was kind of aiming for. I thought that if a foreigner were to write a novel in the Japanese tradition of novel writing, as it were, why not me? I had that conscious aim and gave it my best shot. I had a vague notion of what a Japanese-style novel meant in terms of mood and atmosphere, and also its indirectness. But of course, there's no rule book to consult about writing as I hoped I might. Mostly, I relied on my confidence that my reading of Japanese fiction would rub off on my own novel. Kanazawa has been out for less than a year, but the people who've liked the book have sometimes commended it for its Japanese sensibility, again, whatever that means. And those who haven't liked it would probably be appalled by that. But I think these ideas I've just expressed about my intentions as I set out to write the book and how it's been perceived so far are important, especially for those of us who write about Japan or any country or culture that's technically not our own, or those who may do so in the future. One important rule of literature is that conflict drives a story, and the resolution of that conflict is generally what keeps us reading until the story's end. In common to a lot of foreign novels set in Japan is that their primary conflicts tend to focus squarely on the protagonist's foreignness there, either in how the protagonist perceives he's being treated as a foreigner, or in how he makes sense of a country whose language and customs he's not fluent in, or she, as the case may be. In Kanazawa, that sort of conflict, I think, factors only peripherally into my story. Emmett has been in Japan long enough to have learned the language and culture. He has proven himself to be highly adaptable and deeply respectful of how the people around him live. That means that he relates to the Japanese people in the novel on an essentially equal footing. Because of this, as the author of Kanazawa, I can focus on other sources of conflict to move things forward and underpin the novel with a pace and tone that perhaps seems strange to some readers but aligns with the types of Japanese novels that I've read and loved. In any case, Emmett's clearly capable of observing and understanding what goes on in the family between its different members. The family has a lot of issues it must deal with, but none of them are centered on Emmett. Of course, he and Mirai have their own issues, primarily about where to live, in Tokyo or in Kanazawa. But again, their conflict has nothing to do with his being a gaijin. I think that's maybe what makes Kanazawa unique, or at least my treatment of a story set in contemporary Japan with an American protagonist. Emmett's attached to all these family-centered conflicts in the novel, but he, or should I say his foreignness, is not at their center. As an author, I almost take for granted that he's not Japanese, and yet I never let the reader forget that he's American. What matters most to me about this, I guess, is the perception that yes, I'm writing about Japan as an outsider, as someone not Japanese, but I've done it in what I hope is the right way, if such a thing exists. Or not the right way, but a right way, by not exoticizing and instead viewing the Japanese characters objectively, portraying them as actual individuals with agency, rather than simply as other or them, or merely as the players of roles within a non-Western family. I hope that's true of my first novel, Lotus Land, too, and my forthcoming novel, The Heron Catchers. Though interestingly, literary agents and many publishers don't seem to want these things, because they may not sell as well as novels with those other well-established tropes, despite such approaches being frustrating to many readers these days. Viet Thanh Nguyen in The Sympathizer shows this to great effect, though he uses movies, veiled references to Apocalypse Now especially, rather than novels to make the point. I also want to say that whenever I write a novel set in a country and culture that isn't my own, which is pretty much always, I'm cognizant of the pitfalls inherent in that, and I try to avoid them. I hope it's something that distinguishes my novels, which always have as their protagonists people like myself, but who are decidedly not myself. I'm not saying that should be an unbreakable rule, because I think that to innovate in fiction, and in art in general, one should always aim to stretch boundaries and break barriers, even break so-called rules. But I do think writers need to be careful about certain sensitivities that weren't so predominant in the recent past. Voice is a big one of them, meaning trying not to speak on behalf of a collective that is different from the collective you yourself belong to. I'm not saying that it can't or shouldn't be done, only that particular care and sensitivity should be given to it. It not always is. At the same time, writers shouldn't necessarily sidestep what may offend. It's important not to be afraid to write what your novel needs, and sometimes that may be hard for readers to accept. Anyone who's read Kanazawa or any other fiction I've written will likely know that sense of place is very important to me. Of course, it's important to every writer, but I feel I devote more time in my novels to place than most. I may not pull it off very successfully ever in my writing, but in any event, my novels almost always start with setting, and then I usually overdevelop setting in my initial drafts, and I'm bogged down with cutting back on it during revision. I'd keep it all if I could, but I know it doesn't work for most readers. I think the reason I'm so drawn to setting is that it enables me to escape into whatever place I'm writing about. It builds a foundation for the dream space in which I create. That may be why I don't go much for science fiction or fantasy, because I have difficulty placing myself in or imagining successfully the worlds that aren't this world's settings their authors create. As far as the influence on Kanazawa of place, it influences it a great deal. I spend a lot of time showing Emmett's love of Kanazawa, particularly because it's a necessary contrast to Mirai's feeling for the city. Her desire to live in Tokyo contrasts with his desire to live in Kanazawa, and again, that drives the conflict between them. But I also develop the setting as much as I do because I don't expect readers to be as familiar with it as other more frequently tourist, more media-loved cities like Tokyo and Kyoto. I felt that responsibility to the reader. The city of Kanazawa is compact, possible to see on foot in a single day perhaps, if you have good walking shoes and are in decent shape, and if it's not raining or snowing. And in Kanazawa, it often seems like it's doing one or the other. So it's natural for the characters to bump up against a lot of what one finds there. Kenrokuen Gardens, the Sai and Asano rivers, the 3 former geisha districts, the heavily touristed Omicho Market, Utatsuyama, the temple districts, the many statues around the city that Emmett's father-in-law obsessively draws. And of course, the literary monuments and museums that Emmett and his mother-in-law are attracted to. And Hakusan is always there in the background too, exerting its pull on the characters and being where the novel's climax occurs. I did what I could to get it all in my novel, and my publisher, Stonebridge Press, was kind enough to include a map at the beginning to show these places. One thing that map allows readers to do if they visit Kanazawa or get on Google Street View is to look for the statues that appear in my book. There wasn't a particular event or reason that made me want to have them in the novel. I remember wanting to cast a bit of a spotlight on Kanazawa's statuary, which neither travelers nor local people ever seem to talk about. They seem to be ignored generally, as if they're only strange trees in the city's landscape maybe, or the extensions of buildings around them. They're all over the city, and some are incredibly beautiful and provocative, and I remember wanting to give them their due in my novel. I think they gained importance in my novel for subconscious reasons. I didn't originally plan for them to be so important to the lives of Emmett's parents-in-law, but I'm glad they turned out to be central to their story. What's funny is that whenever I pass the statues that appear in my novel, I see them now as being associated with its characters. Though, of course, those associations are all completely fabricated because the characters aren't real. So I created a surreal situation for myself, it seems. Something else that isn't real, maybe, is the Yamamba figure that I wrote into the novel near its end. Yamamba is a no play I've long known about and that's fascinated me, and which I've seen performed at the Nogaku in Kanazawa. It's about a group of travelers on their way to a famous temple who encounter an old woman in the mountains. A young female from the group offers to sing a song about a mountain crone, and the old woman turns out to be the very mountain crone the song is based on. Knowing of the play's Buddhist underpinnings sparked my curiosity, but it's also just an interesting story. And though it wasn't set in what's now Ishikawa Prefecture, it took place in the mountains not so far away, in the Hokuriku region, from what my research uncovered. That fact helped me decide to incorporate it into Kanazawa. The novel also incorporates a bit of Buddhist thought, and Yamamba fits in nicely with that. It also gave me the chance to create something rather magical near the end of the novel, something touching more deeply on the spiritual, on the numinous, on the supernatural, which was a nice change of pace for me, and probably for the novel as well. It was also my way of paying a bit more homage to the supernatural elements Kyoka often developed in his work. And that brings me back to Izumi Kyoka. As the back cover of my novel suggests, Kanazawa contains intertextual moments in which it interacts, if you will, with some of his writing. I came across Kyoka well before I considered moving to Kanazawa. Since majoring in Japanese studies in college in the early 90s, I've been devouring Japanese fiction in translation, probably an average of 10 or 15 titles a year if you simply divide the number I've read and reread by the number of years I've been reading them. One reason I wanted to make Kyoka a key part of my novel was because he's from Kanazawa, where I lived for 5 years and am now living again, and there are monuments to him all over the city. He's kind of unavoidable. He even has a cookie commemorating him, or he did at one time. So he was in my consciousness from the start, or even before then. Also, I had in my possession 2 wonderful collections of Kyoka's short stories, Japanese Gothic Tales and In Light of Shadows, both translated by Charles Shiro Inoue. They're amazing stories that, as I said before, I feel should be much more widely known and read, and more of his untranslated works made available in English, which was another reason I made Kyoka a key part of the book, to spark new interest in his writing. Also, while living in Kanazawa, I started digging around for information on his life, and Inoue's critical biography of Kyoka, The Similitude of Blossoms, is a treasure trove of such info. Cody Polton also wrote a book about Kyoka's plays called Spirits of Another Sort, and that, too, was full of interesting details about Kyoka's life. I guess that writing a novel that in some ways focused on Kyoka made me feel closer to his life and work, as well as the time he was living, elements which can still be found in Kanazawa, despite how the city has changed since he grew up there. Once I became more familiar with his upbringing in Kanazawa and the literary works he set there, I found myself encountering Kyoka more often in my daily life. I'm now going to add a bit more to what I said about him earlier. Although again, I'm no Kyoka scholar, let me share a few more tidbits about his life and writing. As a person, he was by most accounts rather strange. And like many people, perhaps like many of us, he had supporters and detractors, rivals as well as admirers. And there are many anecdotes about Kyoka's eccentricities. He had intense phobias that, while preventing him from leading a normal life, perhaps directed his writing in idiosyncratic ways, making it deeper in certain respects and more complicated, more complex, even more sophisticated. When combined with his lyrical gifts, supernatural horrors in his stories were often underlain with a sense of beauty and even reverence. He was famously afraid of dogs, bacteria, rodents, and loud noises such as thunder, and he sensed supernatural powers at work around him constantly. He viewed language, even individual words, as possessing supernatural power. He sanctified the pages he wrote on with water droplets, and sometimes he burned to ash letters he cut from printed material, which he then ingested in the belief that it would prevent him from catching disease. Single words, in fact, and their associations in Kyoka's mind would propel him to write entire stories. After he died, it was discovered that he kept in his writing desk a note he'd written cautioning himself to use letters with care, for the power was something real and to be reckoned with. I want to say here that my novel does not reflect the way Kyoka wrote or the archetypes he built all his fiction on. For example, his fascination with and emphasis on the relationship between death and either sexuality or love, or with female characters, usually through their sacrifice being the salvation of male characters, or with intense mother longing, or with the rejection of the rational and real in favor of a fantastical Edo period outlook on the world. And I couldn't have imitated him in any of those respects, even if I'd tried. He was inimitable, both in his narrative style and worldview, which are probably his greatest contributions to Japanese literature, or at least what he's best remembered for now. Late in my novel, I did, however, bring in a ghostly figure, a yokai perhaps, the Yamamba I mentioned earlier, after nightfall, when Kyoka thought evil spirits came out, and on a sacred mountain that some of my characters associated with an old acquaintance's death. And I like to think that Kyoka would have approved of my incorporating something possibly supernatural to the novel's climactic scene. Although Kyoka left Kanazawa to live in Tokyo at the age of 17 and maintained unfavorable feelings toward his hometown until he died, the city frequently drew his focus as an author. Where Kanazawa served as the setting for his fiction, a full third of it, in fact, it was always in areas of the city where people on the margins lived. And Kanazawa itself, it should be said, provincial as it was marginal compared to Tokyo. It was a place where old Japan, old traditions, and old myths were kept alive, at least in Kyoka's imagination. Kanazawa was a place where he could go back in time, especially along the Asano River near his boyhood home, close to where the lowest social classes lived and where cemeteries, where so many fearful spirits resided, dotted the landscape. If not for the efforts of more recent writers like Yukio Mishima, who has largely been credited for the revival of Japanese interest in Kyoka's work from the late 1960s on, Kyoka might no longer be so well known in Japan. Kyoka has infiltrated the imaginations of creators of contemporary manga and anime in Japan, and he has also influenced certain successful contemporary Japanese authors, most notably Haruki Murakami, Yuko Tsushima, Kono Taiko, and Keiichiro Hirano. To incorporate Kyoka into my novel, I researched his life, critical examinations of his writing, and read the stories and plays he wrote that have been translated into English. Based on what I thought I wanted to write, I noted down scenes and characters from his works and other information about him that I came across, which I felt could be used in my novel to interesting effect, and went from there. In his own writings, Kyoka also made allusions to the Meiji period Kusazoshi illustrated books and Edo period Gesaku literature, such as Jipensha Iku's comic novel, Shank's Mare, that he admired so greatly. Incorporating Kyoka into my novel wasn't a foremost concern to me initially, but opportunities to do so kept presenting themselves while I was writing and rewriting. It was necessary that those opportunities came about organically to support my story, which was all my own. But I myself, as a writer and resident of Kanazawa, associate Kyoka with the city, so it was probably natural that he'd enter my novel at different points, one way or another. In short, I simply found ways to make literary references to Kyoka's writing and give them over to my story and characters, though in no way do those moments overwhelm or interfere with my novel. I tried to do the same thing with what I learned about his life, both in Kanazawa, where he grew up, and in Tokyo, where he spent his adult life. One of the more developed examples of such borrowing occurs midway through Kanazawa when Emmett and Mirai gaze out a gallery window at the Tenjin Bridge. Some of what they see mirrors what Kyoka's characters saw in his story Kecho, titled Bird of a Different Feather in English and translated by Peter Bernard. Men fishing in the Asano River, who Emmett mistakes at first for giant mushrooms because of the traditional straw outfits they wear. And the story about the monkey that's left tied to a tree on one side of the bridge, which Mirai said she saw as a child, also comes from Kecho. Later in the novel, when Emmett and Mirai stay overnight at a ryokan in Katayamazu Onsen with two old friends, the boys who appear on TV after drowning in the sea off Atami while wearing the heads of a Chinese dragon dance costume. That's a nod to an important scene in Kyoka's Shunchu, One Day in Spring in English. Another example, the otters in Shiramine that Emmett and Mirai hear playing small gourd drums at night. Shiramine, as far as I know, doesn't have any otters in the two rivers that flow through the town, not far from Hakusan. If I'm wrong about this, I'd still bet that Shiramine's otters don't bang around on gourd drums outside any local ryokans. The otters are a nod to the story Uta Andon, titled A Song by Lantern Light in English and translated by Charles Shiro Inoue, in which otters come out under the moonlight from the Ibi River in Gifu Prefecture and play gourd drums. Similarly, the blind masseur who wanders around Shiramine with a whistle, giving massages and singing no librettos to the accompaniment of a hand drum, was inspired by the blind masseur in Uta Andon. And Kyoka's maternal grandfather was also a drummer who performed under the direct patronage of the Maida rulers. Most obviously is the final chapter in Kanazawa, which takes place at Renshoji Temple in the Higashiyama area of Kanazawa, where Kyoka set the entirety of Ruko Shinso, the heart vine in English, another Inoue translation, the final story Kyoka ever wrote, finishing it 2 weeks before he died. The plot and some of the characters from that story echo strongly in the final chapter of Kanazawa. And I make direct reference to his play Yashagaike, or The Demon Pond, as well, when Emmett's mother-in-law travels with her literary club to the actual Yashaga Pond in Fukui Prefecture. Less developed instances include one of Emmett's university colleagues, whose germophobia is based on one of many phobias Kyoka suffered. The family background of Mr. Kurokawa, the no actor whose house Emmett and Mirai originally intend to live in, mirrors that of Kyoka's parents. Kurokawa's father was an engraver, like Kyoka's father was, and his mother derived from a long line of no actors, like Kyoka's mother's family did. Also, there's a scene in chapter 5 where Emmett's father-in-law drinks Kiku Masamune sake, which I learned was Kyoka's favorite sake. I've drunk it myself and kept a bottle of it on my writing desk as a kind of good luck charm while writing Kanazawa. And there's a brief scene on the Tenjin Bridge again, in which some small drama plays out between a tourist rickshaw driver and a young woman in tourist kimono, borrowed from a black and white movie I found on YouTube of Kyoka's Giketsu Kyoketsu, Noble Blood, Heroic Blood in English, in which a fateful meeting occurs between the characters Kinya and the geisha Shiraito, who has her own statue along the Asano River, incidentally, just off of Izumi Kyoka Street. There's also the young monk in chapter 4, which I'll read from tonight, who Emmett follows along the Sai River, as well as the touts and katamachi he encounters on the way, with the weather changing conditions quite suddenly, borrowings from the beginning of Kyoka's The Holy Man of Mount Koya, and consistent with the aesthetic motif that Kyoka followed in all his works, my novel too contains scenes in which the colors red and white appear together. For example, in my novel's opening scene, when an ambulance's red light reflects off of falling snow. In chapter 2, when Asuka's lip starts bleeding and a drop appears on a piece of white octopus sashimi, and a few pages later in the snow. The TV images of the drowned boys lying on white sand with their feet pointed to a crimson horizon and the red costumes beside them. the red dragonfly Mirai draws on white lantern paper in the final chapter, and probably a few other instances I can't recall. My desire for my novel to interact with Kyoka's life and work came from my feeling of encountering him in Kanazawa in different situations. Places in the city where he spent time as a young man, and some of the real-life settings of his own fiction remain. If you know where to look for them, it's not difficult to feel even now like you're passing through the same Kanazawa he once knew. I thought it would be interesting and add texture and depth to my novel to have such interactions across 100 years' time in a Kanazawa that has changed greatly since Kyoka's lifetime. I found that idea magical and, as a writer, a source of inspiration. Okay, before I end my formal presentation, I want to offer you 3 short quotes about the validity of literature and what it can bring to our lives. As an author of literary fiction, writing at a time when reading seems to be undervalued at best, I can't help but feel the need to say this. And in fact, I said this several months ago to students in the Japanese Studies department at my alma mater, where I also spoke about Kanazawa. But what follows isn't only meant for students just starting out in life. It's also meant for adults from all walks of life, which means all of you here tonight. In a conversation with the filmmaker Paul Cronin, as reported by Robert Pogue Harrison in the Los Angeles Review of Books, the German film director Werner Herzog said, "Read, read, 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 read. Those who read own the world. Those who immerse themselves in the internet or watch too much television lose it. Our civilization is suffering profound wounds because of the wholesale abandonment of reading by contemporary society." Much can be said about the social and political validity of fiction and literature. I don't know how many of you regularly read literature or value it like Herzog wants you to, but I agree with him that it's undervalued in the present age. And I, too, would like to see us step back from all the technological distractions that bombard us and instead engage more deeply and carefully with the human experience, which literature uniquely allows us to do. Literature has the capacity to teach readers empathy and compassion, and to see the world and the people in it from points of view we're unfamiliar with. This brings to mind a podcast called The Wrath-Bearing Tree that I heard a few months ago. One of its hosts mentioned that the British writer and philosopher Iris Murdoch once said that the most important thing for a novel to do is to reveal that other people exist. In response to that quote, my good friend, the author Gary Craig Powell said, "I would add, and not minding that those people are different from us." We talk about ideals such as tolerance and diversity, but often, isn't it merely lip service? You need a foundation from which to put those things in practice, and literature can provide that. Probably not surprisingly, I do in fact believe that the more literature you read, the more empathic and compassionate you're likely to become, and the more understanding of the always evolving, always complicated, yet endlessly fascinating human condition. In this increasingly divisive world we live in, is there anyone who would claim that having these qualities isn't important? That's the power of literature, of simply reading. Here's my final quote for you tonight. Works of literature are, by their very nature, non-specialist books. They are written to criticize or depict matters of common concern to all. They bring people together, stripped naked, regardless of profession or class, and break down all such walls that separate us. Thus, I believe them to be the most worthy and least harmful means for binding us together as human beings. This quote, translated from Japanese to English by J. Rubin in his Injurious to Public Morals, Writers in the Meiji State, is by Natsume Soseki, whose novel Kokoro was the first Japanese novel I ever read, assigned in a college course on Japanese culture that I took one semester. The quote dates from the early 1900s, and to me, its relevance hasn't dimmed since Soseki's lifetime. He died in 1916. All of these quotes, in fact, reverberate to me as almost immutable truths, and they will continue to reverberate no less truthfully in the years, the decades to come. I'm quite certain. Okay. I'm going to read a section of chapter 4 in Kanazawa now, if only to give a flavor of the novel to those who haven't read it yet. Although the section doesn't deal with Izumi Kyoka, it's the shortest of the novel's first 4 chapters, and reading anything past that would require too much explanation about what's already happened in the story. It's also a section in which I don't have to strain myself to distinguish between character voices, especially female voices. I don't do women's voices particularly well, and so I'm just going to read that section. And in that section, we find Emmett on his way home from university when he bumps into a young man dressed in a monk's clothing and feels compelled to follow him. He does so for several kilometers through the snow until he seems to recognize the monk, a former student of his who dropped out of university. His thoughts about the former student mirror his own concerns about a new life path he seeks for himself. Okay. This is on page 52. The bus lurched to a halt before the former 4th High School, a brick building that now housed a literary museum his mother-in-law sometimes visited. Stepping onto the street, he spotted the entrance to Kenrokuen Garden in the shadow of 2 old embracing pine trees. Although it hadn't been in his plans, he now thought to himself, why go straight home when the park would distract him from the chaos in his mind? He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen the beautiful shapes that snow made of the large landscape garden, how the piled whiteness framed the winter-black waters of the ponds and streams, and the way Kenrokuen's gardeners protected trees from snow with yukitsuri ropes. Nor could he remember having visited during any other season recently, not since the spring wedding photos he and Mirai had taken along the garden's iris-filled streams, in the tree shade of its villas, and before its lotus pond and shrine. Photos Mirai had arranged in an elaborate album and now kept beside their bed. Had he not been here in the last 5 years? After stepping toward the entrance, however, he stopped at the sight of a monk shuffling in his direction. Stubble speckled the monk's red face as if he'd been journeying through the cold for days. He wore a conical straw hat covered in plastic, and a dark knee-length cloak of frayed, pilling wool hung from his body. An off-white flannel scarf drooped at his neck. Knitted gloves with holes in the knuckles covered his hands. White socks encased his legs, and wooden clogs crusted with snow clad his feet. The monk shuffled past him, his wooden staff clacking hollowly. His face reminded him of someone, and a name he couldn't recall struggled to loosen itself from his tongue. The monk continued to the end of the road and waited at the stoplight to cross. When he stepped into the crosswalk, Emmett followed him from a distance. Passing through the Katamachi Entertainment District, Emmett was surprised to see so many bar and club touts at this hour lining the scramble intersection. More tenacious than usual, they forced their information cards on passers-by. One young man grabbed Emmett's sleeve and tried to pull him toward a building, but Emmett shook him off. No one bothered the monk or could even make eye contact with him. He walked through the touts unmolested. Where Katamachi ended, a bridge spanned the Sai River to Teramachi, the temple district on the opposite side. He expected the monk to cross it. He turned left, however, down a narrow street lined with leafless, snow-laden cherry trees. As they walked, separated by 30 or 40 meters, what had been an almost spring-like afternoon changed to its usual North Country conditions, replacing with long shadows the rays of sunlight that had brightened Kanazawa until now. Wherever it had come from, the cloud cover sent a deep chill through Emmett. The monk walked on the pavement where the snow became slush. He passed beneath the cherry trees, then cut right at a public restroom, past a memorial to the writer Muro Saisei, and went straight through to some steps that ended partway down an all-white slope. Upon reaching the river where pedestrians had kicked an uneven path through the snow, he continued toward the mountains. It began to rain, but soon the rain became sleet, and the landscape lost any semblance of hue. The sky and air were varied shades of gray and white. The river where snow hadn't accumulated was deep black. The city on both sides of it was steeped in frozen dreariness. Except for the cold and wind, it was like being in an old Shubun painting. The monk trudged on. Emmett followed him until the next bridge, even though the wind was in bursts, cold and fierce. Shivering, he couldn't imagine how this monk persevered in these conditions. The sleet had turned to snow. Daijoji, Emmett whispered to himself. Surely he was on his way there. Whenever Emmett had visited the great temple, he had seen a poster near the entrance in which a procession of monks exited the temple gate into a frozen landscape, a harsh winter ascetic practice called kanshugyo. However, they were exiting as a group, looking as freshly washed as their monk's clothing, and were only venturing into the local neighborhood to collect alms. But kanshugyo took place in late January. This monk seemed to be on some kind of pilgrimage. Emmett had seen monks before near Higashi Honganji Temple, not far from Kanazawa Station, but he never saw them here. He also couldn't remember having seen them looking as thin and ragged as this one. Soon the ground beside the path widened and the houses on the street above it grew smaller with the distance. Ahead of them, traffic rushed across Shimokiku Bridge, beneath which ducks and herons perched on rocks. The monk kept his head down, seemingly oblivious to his surroundings. For a moment, Emmett thought he remembered why the monk seemed familiar, but as soon as the thought came, it disappeared. The monk seemed to have been plucked from a previous time, 30 years past, 100, even 440 years ago, when Kanazawa was founded. For a Buddhist monk, would the passage of time make any difference? The monk halted at the intersection where Yukimi Bridge started. He waited for the stoplight to change, as if his plan was to proceed straight ahead, over the snow-white hills and into the mountains. Emmett came even with him. Clouds of steam pushed from the man's colorless lips. He was younger than Emmett had assumed, the face of the same aspect as the students he taught, and it was this thought that connected the young man to the mystery that had eluded him. The monk reminded him of a former student. His parents, farmers in Mie Prefecture, had pressured the boy to pursue an engineering degree and become the family's first university graduate. The boy's name was Michio. He'd been quiet and studious, and though teased for being Inakamono, a country boy, his peers all seemed to like him. In the 2 classes Emmett taught him, Michio started strong only for his efforts to flag in the final weeks of both terms, which was when most of his grade was decided. Emmett passed him the first time as a nod to his potential, but the second time the boy stopped attending class and Emmett failed him. When Emmett inquired with Michio's classmates about his whereabouts, rumors swirled that he had quit school to work a menial job full-time, while others said he had returned to Mie after his parents were in some kind of accident. Once, Emmett had assigned a narrative essay and encouraged his students, if they had trouble choosing a topic, to describe their dreams. One student expounded on his Buddhist faith, explaining that if he could travel back in time, he would train as a monk, not as an engineer. The student wanted to devote himself to the Noble Eightfold Path, but he'd succumbed to pressure to study at university. Emmett would never forget the opening sentence. What I learned in school has no practical value in the religious life I seek. Had the writer been Michio, Emmett felt he would have remembered. Michio hadn't seemed that type of person, and, looking back, Emmett thought the essay more developed and articulate than the boy could have written. Yet, Emmett couldn't place this essay with a face or name. He also couldn't recall what essay Michio might have turned in, or if he'd turned one in at all. Emmett found his voice. "Are you Michio?" he said. "Michio, Mikun, from Mie Prefecture. Do you remember me?" Although the monk continued to stare straight ahead, his eyes had widened. Violently, he shook his head. "You were a university student recently, no? You had nearly completed your engineering degree but disappeared. You left before graduating." The monk thumped his staff on the ground, producing a hollow noise. With the snow slanting into his face, he glanced to his right across the bridge. Had the boy taken a vow of silence? Perhaps Emmett was mistaken and his forwardness had embarrassed him. In shame, he wondered if he'd shattered some kind of trance. The monk turned and half ran to the opposite end of the bridge. He then crossed to the other side, stopped, and looked back at Emmett, who could barely see him in the distance and through the snowfall. Emmett felt the monk was beckoning to him, issuing an invitation. A moment later, Rather than continue up the paved road, the monk descended through the snow to a path alongside the river. The monk's figure faded to a stain in the white landscape. When he disappeared, Emmett sensed that he'd lost something or had encountered some unanswerable riddle. Starting back, Emmett glanced across the river and considered where the young man might go from there. If not to Daijoji, perhaps there was a temple nearby that would welcome him. Or maybe the mountains of Hakusan were his destination after all. The mountains were large here, whiter than the wintry sky. The sun slipped through a break in the clouds, turning Hakusan so white Emmett had to shield his eyes. He continued walking, eager suddenly to see Mirai, to be home by the time her Ikebana class ended, and she returned to pack for Tokyo. Overnight, he had become worried about his marriage in a way he never had before. The more he thought about it, the more he hated that she was leaving in the morning, but he also knew there was no stopping her. Okay, thank you.
Finished?
Finished.
Thank you, David.
Sure.
The book's available at the front desk if you'd like to buy a copy. And I'd like to open the floor to questions. If anybody wants to come up and ask David a question, please raise your hand. I'll call you up and you introduce yourself and what your affiliation is, and we'll take it from there. Don't all stand up at once. Okay, I've got a couple of questions. What do you think of, you said you had some negative things to say about the internet early on. What do you think about e-books and your book, reading your book on Kindle? I mean, you have this cultural gem that you've just produced, and the cover is a work of art. And how do you feel when you see it on the internet in an e-book form?
When I see it in ebook form, I'm pleased that it's available in that medium. I went through a period when I was traveling a lot, and I couldn't haul around a lot of heavy books with me, and having ebooks on a Kindle reader or on my laptop was something that was very convenient, and I really appreciated having that. I much prefer having a hard copy in my hand. I like the feel of the paper, the heft, the smell of it, everything. But there are times when we can't always have the books that we want, or you want to order them and it's going to take weeks for them to be delivered or whatever, and you can have the book the moment you want it. And so I think the internet is bad for a lot of reasons, but for having these digital books available, I don't have, I think that's a good thing in the end.
Okay, I've got a number of questions that I'd like to ask. Just if you want to interrupt, raise your hand and you can come up and ask David anything. I would like to know what is your writing routine like? What kind of writer are you? Are you the kind of guy who gets up in the middle of the night when you have a dream about something you want to write about and make notes? You're driving down the street, do you stop the car? And are you that kind of person, or what is your daily routine like?
I'd like to be more of that kind of person. It took me a long time to develop the discipline that I think all writers need to have. And I remember when I finished Kanazawa, after maybe two years and 4 months or something like that, the very following day when I knew that it was done and I'd set it aside to submit, I started a new novel. And I finished it in 23 days, 260 pages.
How many words?
How many words? It must have been 60-some thousand, I guess.
Wow.
I don't remember exactly. But it came out to about 260 pages. But it was basically, I was able to write a chapter a day. for around 20 days, 23 days or whatever. And it just all poured out of me. I usually work with outlines, not super detailed, but maybe for a book, I'll just come up with a 3-page single-spaced outline. And I'll initially follow it, and then it just takes on its own life. And then I'll have to revise the outline, and at some point I probably give up the outline altogether. But for the Heron Catchers that I wrote initially in 23 days, that was just the rough draft, mind you. I wrote simply one short paragraph that I'd keep at the top of the page, and that was my outline for the day. And once I got to the end of it, I set it aside, and I opened another document, and that was the next chapter, and I put a little paragraph at the top, and that was my outline for the next chapter the next day. And my wife and our cats were good enough not to interfere in my writing, because I was writing for 8 to 10 to 12 hours a day, and it just poured out of me. It's never really happened to me since then. After I finished that, I set it aside because I thought it was just too horrible of a manuscript to ever really have any future. And then my wife and I started our plans to move back to America, and that disrupted my whole routine. And I've still not quite recovered from that. I have started at least 2 more books, which I hope to finish eventually. I don't have any sense yet of when those books will be finished. I'm not in a hurry to finish them. I don't want to feel hurried ever to get my writing done. But yeah, I came back to the Heron Catchers when I felt settled enough back in America to start writing every day. And I realized that the draft that I thought must be so atrocious actually had legs. And so I spent the next several months after that revising it. And I probably put in just under a year. I'd like to think I got it done in less than a year for some reason. Even though I said I don't want to hurry myself in my writing, there's something for me to celebrate in writing, getting a final revision done within 12 months. And I think that's partly because the first book I ever started writing, I've been working on off and on for over 20 years, and it's still not done. So, but you asked about my routine. My routine, it just seems there are so many disruptions, and when I can't get any writing done during the day, I really try to just shut myself away from everything in the evenings, and I try to get my work done in the evenings. But back when I was writing regularly, it was usually in the mornings and the afternoons. I could go maybe 6 hours in a day, interrupting only for food and to use the restroom, that kind of thing. And yeah.
Well, different writers have different daily routines, and they have different outputs. Gogol could only write a few hundred words a day, and he was so it was so difficult for him to get started that he would have his servant chain him to his desk in the morning from 9 until 12. Somerset Maugham was another one who wrote from 9 to 1 o'clock every day. Joseph Wambaugh, who wrote the police novels that were so popular in the 80s and 90s, he used to work a full day as a policeman, as a detective on the LAPD, and then he'd come home and pound out 3,000 words. Gay Talese, who I know about, with former New York Times reporter, could only produce 1,000 words a day. And he would type out his article, and then he would tack it onto the wall, and he would go over to the other side of the room, and he'd take a pair of binoculars and read it. And if that was he was a New York Times reporter, so that was the way that he recreated the front page of the New York Times. And so if it looked okay through the binoculars, then he knew it was all right. Yukio Mishima used to go out and, in the Ginza every night, and he'd come home at midnight or 1 o'clock, and he'd write until dawn. So you say how many, you write mostly in the evening because you've got all these other things to do during the day. How many words how many publishable words can you produce in one sitting?
I don't know if they're publishable, but I always aim for about 1,000 words in a day. I used to keep an Excel file just to keep myself sort of honest and working hard every day. I don't do that anymore. Maybe I should. But for me, 1,000 was enough, and I had never minded stopping in the middle of something, which is what Hemingway said, was a good thing to do also, just so that something incomplete, I would have a chance to complete it with fresh ideas, maybe a fresh perspective from the previous day's work. And but yeah, about 1,000 a day would be something I could really feel good about. And writing is not something I always feel that great about, just because it takes so much revising to get to the point where I'm ready to share it. So, if I could get 300 words in a day, that's at least one page. And a book is not going to write itself. And even if you're just producing one page every day, within a year you've got a 365-page book, at least a draft of it. And I always kept that in mind. So,
how many drafts do you need before it's ready to hit the...
That's a good question. I mean, when I revise, I don't usually go from the very first word to the very last word. I'm just revising in sections. And I'm just rereading constantly. And then something strikes me as wrong, or if I've made a change later on, I realize that it's had this ripple effect on everything that came before it, and I have to smooth out all those wrinkles. And so that's also a form of revision, and I would kind of do things that way too. But I mean, I would say that Kanazawa probably went through close to 8 to 10 full revisions, I guess, if I added everything together. And the Heron Catchers probably went through about 5 or 6.
Do you read your stuff out loud?
No, I don't like the sound of my voice when I speak.
How about, I'm curious about Kanazawa. It's, it seems like such an enchanting place. Do they have a problem with youth all wanting to move to Tokyo? And what is the relationship of Kanazawa to the big Nikon?
I think so. I think a lot of young people like to move to Tokyo. I don't think it's as noticeable as other places that I've lived, like Fukui or Akita. I think it's much more noticeable in places like that. I don't think that Kanazawa really it just doesn't have the range of jobs that a lot of young people necessarily want to do. But the arts and crafts industries are so big there. They're so well entrenched. It draws a lot of people to Kanazawa from other places. My wife and I bought an akiya in Yamanaka Onsen, which is about an hour's drive south of Kanazawa, and we had it renovated, and I use that often as my own writing space because I'll be undisturbed there. But directly across the street from our house is a wood turning and lacquerware training center that's supported by the prefecture, and at any one time they'll have usually about 3 or 4 young people from anywhere. The last time that I asked the people there where they were from Kanazawa, they were from Kaga, which is where Yamanaka Onsen is located. They were from Nara, and I can't remember the other place, maybe like Shizuoka or something like that. So the area is a draw also, not from Tokyo, but from other parts of the country. But that's Yamanaka Onsen I'm talking about. But I think the same holds true to a certain extent in Kanazawa, because there are so many master craftspeople there. And it's, as is Kyoto. Kyoto is even more so. But, you know, for all the tech jobs, they're going to go to Tokyo, right? But I think a lot of people appreciate, I do think that a lot of the young people in Kanazawa are very proud of where they're from. And the family ties, I think, just in my experience with the people that I know there, tend to be fairly strong. And if they go away, they often come back. I've met a lot of people who moved to Tokyo for a number of years and then came back, you know. And usually that was for family reasons, to care for their parents or something like that. But, yeah.
What are the top 5 things to do or see in Kanazawa for someone who's never been there before?
To eat fresh seafood, usually at the Omicho Ichiba, which is just down the street from the train station, going to the geisha districts, especially Higashichaya, which is a well-preserved district of the city. It's probably the largest and most well-preserved of the 3 geisha districts. And it's right across the street, across the bridge on the Asano River from Kazui-machi, which is another geisha district there. What else do they do? There's the ninja temple in the temple district, Teramachi, that a lot of people like to go to. I have never been there because apparently they turn off the lights on you when you're in some very tight enclosed space, and I don't want to experience that. What else do people do? Lots of things. They're just not coming to mind. The samurai district, they have a Bukeyashiki district. And a lot of people go there and sort of wander through some of the preserved street. It's not very large, but what they have, really just a couple of streets, it's very atmospheric and very nice. Then there's Kenroku-en Gardens, which is one of the 3 largest, most important landscape gardens, I believe, walking landscape gardens. And across from that, on a bridge, the street there used to be a big moat, but they've made a state route where it used to be, the Kanazawa Castle, which is very impressive, and the grounds around it, which are huge. I would say those are the main things people like to do when they come. They miss a lot, though, because there's so much more to do and to see, especially in nature. Just climbing to the top of Utatsuyama, which is behind Higashijaya. Walking along the Sai River, it's a beautiful, beautiful river. A lot of machiya, even some kominka in the city that are well preserved. They're tearing a lot of that architecture down, which is a real shame. But hopefully they'll start doing more to preserve the old architecture that they have, because I think it's a real draw for a lot of people.
How about Western influence? They have a lot of McDonald's hamburgers and Shakey's pizzas and
Shakey's Pizzas? I don't know if we have a Shakey's Pizzas. I don't think we do.
Domino's Pizza.
There's a Domino's, though. There might even be a Pizza Hut. I don't know. Yeah, there's a McDonald's. There's a new McDonald's in the train station, which is in a really bad location because it's where everybody shops for in the station. Well, it's one of the places where they sell omiyage and a lot of the wagashi and things like that, really sort of delicate sort of items that, you know, you want to enjoy looking at and imagining how they're going to taste and everything. And then the smell from the kitchen of McDonald's just, you know, suffuses the whole area. It's just like, you know, you're looking at some beautifully designed, wonderful, you know, wagashi and the sweets, the Japanese sweets, and it just everything smells like beef and cheese. It's just kind of ruins the atmosphere. I wouldn't say there's too much Western influence there. I mean, a lot of new hotels are being built. It seems in a very sort of random, the urban planning can seem very random at times. And they, like I said, they tear down a lot that I really wish they would keep.
Just to keep the construction business going.
Exactly.
And
I think that's a
money
big part.
flowing into the
There you go.
politicians' cup.
Yeah.
I've read that the snowfalls in winter on the western side of Honshu are among the heaviest in the world. So I wonder what it's like spending a winter in Kanazawa. I mean, is it constant snowfall? Do you spend half your day shoveling snow out of the front yard? Or?
Well, I live on the 12th floor of an apartment right now, but the house in Yamanaka Onsen has had snow that accumulated up to about 3 meters before it went past the roof of our house, and that was miserable trying to shovel all that, just trying to get to the front door. And you know, when you're done with that, you have to help your 80-year-old neighbors shovel their snow too. And there's a little cottage industry there for clearing snow off of rooftops, because it gets so heavy that it's going to collapse the roofs of people's homes if you don't shovel it in time. Kanazawa is not nearly as bad as that. It's not as close to the mountains as Yamanaka Onsen is, but Kanazawa does get its share of snow. I feel that it doesn't accumulate the way that it does in Toyama, for example, or up on the Noto coast, like around Suzu, or
Right.
In that area. I mean, that area it just gets wallops by snowfall. I think that Kanazawa does get a lot of snow, but it's no worse than the snow that I saw growing up in Cincinnati, where I'm from.
Oh, that's in Cincinnati.
Yeah.
Are you a Cincinnati Reds fan?
I used to be when they were contenders. Not so much anymore. Yeah. Sure, of course.
I'm Takeshi Hara. I'm an associate member of this club. Thank you very much for your enlightening explanation of your work, Kanazawa. If I remember correctly, Saisei Muro was also born in Kanazawa Prefecture, right?
Yes, that's correct.
In this sense, in my parochial view, what's your main reason that you incorporated Izumi Kyoka's works into your work? The reason I ask this question is because in my parochial view, Saisei Muro maybe had a much wider and greater sensibility than Izumi Kyoka, because Izumi Kyoka's works is rather stuffy, right? But Saisei Muro's work represent very human melancholy and happiness also. This is my just comment.
Yeah.
And if you have any, if you have answer, I'd appreciate it.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for that question. And that's a really good question. You know, Kanazawa's the people who are considered to be the three giants of Kanazawa literature are Kyoka, Muro Saisei, and Takura Shusei. Yeah. And Kyoka is associated very much with the Asano River. That was where he set some of his fiction and some of his better-known fiction. That's where there's a street that's named after him. One of his characters has a statue along the Asano River. And whereas Muro Saisei is deeply associated with the Saigawa, the Sai River. And they're on different sides of the city. That side of the city is Murosaise's, that side of the river is Izumi, of the city is Izumi Kyoka's. And, Murosaise was a very important and influential poet who, after establishing himself as a poet, started to write novels and became a very successful novelist as well. For me, studying those three writers, which I did, I tried to study all three of them very much. So anything that was published in English about those three writers, there's a good chance that I have it in my library at home. And there was a critical biography that I wrote, that I wish I'd written, but I read about Shusei, and there is a very hard to find collection of short stories by Murosaise, the only one in English that I know of. And I read those short stories and I liked them very much, but I think there are only 3 stories in the collection, and there are no other books of his fiction available in English. I have a book of his I have 2 books of his poetry. One includes a critical biography of his life, and I read that. But Kyoka has there's so much more of his work available in English. And there's so much more available in English about his life. So because of the availability of that information, I was just much more comfortable writing about him, focusing on him. And whether it's true or not, I don't know. But in my reading of those 2 writers' lives, there just was a much deeper and richer mythology associated with Izumi Kyoka. He was such a strange person, and he really resisted the way that other writers in his time were all writing, the whole naturalist school. He just would have nothing to do with them. And there's something very interesting in someone who would be that way to me, who would resist that. And yet, he was forgotten and then he was rediscovered. And now he has a great influence on a lot of manga and anime creators, for example, today. Keiichiro Hirano's recent Ichigatsu Monogatari. It's not yet published in English, but that was heavily influenced by Kyoka too. So I think there's something about the sort of mythology that surrounds Kyoka's life and work that is just very unique, and it spoke to me somehow. But again, there's just a lot more available in English about his life. And I've tried to read him in Japanese, and I couldn't get far at all. I really did try, but he's difficult. You said he's very stuffy, and I've heard the same thing from other people. Yeah. So, thank you.
Any? Just come up to the microphone and introduce yourself.
ダイヤ橋本 from Digital Hollywood University, professor, but teaching data science, not literature, book reviewer part-time. And my question is, I read your book, and most fascinating part in this book is your depiction of intimate relationships between the protagonist, Emmett, and his father-in-law. And to how extent your real relationships with your family affected your novel?
Okay. Yes, thank you for that question. The family in the book, Emmett's family, his in-laws, are all completely made up.
Oh.
My wife's father-in-law died 5 years ago, and he was a butcher, and so he wasn't a drawer, he wasn't an artist, and my wife's mother helped him with the business and helped raise their children. but she was not a model for statues or anything like that. My wife has no younger sister. She has an older brother who, as far as I know, has no artistic leanings. And my wife has no interest in Ikebana. And I think she's a good painter, but she doesn't paint what I would consider on a regular basis. So the family was completely made up, completely, yeah.
Well, then, do you have any other model after the Sando in real life?
I think just the literature, the Japanese literature that I read, just all of it cumulatively gave me a sense of how that family would interact, how they would talk to each other, how they would not talk to each other, and that kind of thing. Yeah, so I think there's probably more, well, certainly there's more of myself in Emmett than there is of my wife's family in any of Mirai and her family. So, and I'm not Emmett, but yeah, I think it just came cumulatively from my experience living in Japan and reading a lot of Japanese literature and things like that. But I appreciate you saying that. It's a very nice compliment. So
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to next work.
Thank you
Hello,
very
teacher.
much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can we keep going? I just had one question about creative writing. I'm a nonfiction journalist, and most of the people that I work with are the same, and so we have a basic pattern. If we're going to write a nonfiction book, we choose a subject, formulate a central question, and then answer it by interviewing a couple of hundred people and reading 100 books and doing all this work, and then you put it together in 10 drafts, and it usually takes 2 or 3 years. But writing a novel is something completely alien to me, and I just wonder how you go about it. How does the process start?
I think the process starts with Kanazawa. It started with setting, and actually the Heron Catchers did too. I wanted to write books that were set in specific places. And somehow, I think this may not make any sense, but just the feelings that I attach to certain places remind me of certain types of people and certain types of lifestyles. And so those characters and the lives that they lead, I think come to me pretty quickly, not clearly, but they're there in my mind. I've got a grasp somehow on who these people are and what's driving them, what their conflicts are, and that kind of thing. I've learned over the years that simple is better when writing a novel. I'm generally drawn to trying to incorporate a lot of research. That's just my natural inclination. But that can be very, very difficult and time-consuming, and it can really block the flow of the novel. If I'm insisting on putting this in there, sometimes the novel doesn't want it in there. You can sense that somehow. And I've just learned that a book tends to flow better in the writing of it, hopefully in the reading of it, when you just sort of keep things simple. So there are certain things that I research, but a lot of the things that I research, I leave out. But it's still been helpful for me to do because it completes, in my imagination, the world that these people live in. Knowing that information for myself is still useful for me, even if I don't use it in the book. I guess it makes me feel I have a stronger sense of authority to be writing about the people and the places that I do, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you. I think we've reached the time that we have to close it. I would like to present you with a one-year membership to the club.
Thank you
Please
very
come
much.
back and visit us.
Thank you.
As
Love
much
to.
as possible.
Love to. Thank you.
I read Kanazawa. I thought it was a really great book, and I thought the sense of place, the atmosphere was really memorable. It was shibui, as we say in Japanese, and I think you did a tremendous job. So thank you for coming tonight, and let's give a round of applause.
Thank you for having me, and thank all of you for coming tonight.